Herr Professor Jürgen. Thank you very much again for those very kind words. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your invitation to come here to Würzburg. So, I do it? You start it, please. That's okay, okay. Okay, well, my name is Steve. I come from the Joint Department of Physics. The words mean that it's joint between the Institute of Cancer Research, which is part of the University of London, and the Royal Marsden Hospital. The Royal Marsden Hospital was founded in the mid-1800s. And what I would like to do today is to tell you a story, really, about IMRT, a very personal retrospective, and mention the key events in the story, and in particular the strong links with Germany that I think you have already acknowledged. So why are we the Royal Marsden Hospital? Well, the Royal was bestowed by the present Queen when she opened the hospital in 1953. So we've been royal since 1953, and before her untimely death, Princess Diana was the patron of the Royal Marsden Hospital, and now her son, the future king, Prince William, I'm sure you know him and his wife, Kate, they're always in the newspapers, and he is now the current patron. The Queen Mother has, of course, passed on. Well, what is the point of showing you this? The point of showing you this is that physicists have equipment, and when the royals come to visit, they like to see things. They don't just want to have a cup of tea and shake hands, they want to see what we do. And so physicists are in a unique position to be able to show them things. Well, the goal of conformal radiotherapy is to shape the high-dose distribution to the target volume, keeping the normal tissues spared as far as possible. It's the goal today. It's always been the goal. And of course, we're in the city in which Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen discovered the X-ray about 8 o'clock in the evening on the 8th of November, 1895, about 500 meters in this direction, in a room that you can visit if you wish to see much of his original equipment. So it's very pertinent that we should be talking about X-rays today. In 1896, medical doctors were treating cancer with X-rays, but they had really very little imaging guidance, and they really didn't know what they were doing or how to apply the radiation. But surprisingly, radiotherapy flourished, and even in the first year or two, there was an established profession of radiotherapy. There were even textbooks on the subject by 1900. In 1920, the British Institute of Radiology formed itself, and then in 1995, all the countries around the world had a Röntgen centenary. The British one was in Birmingham, and my contribution was on the history of computed tomography with X-rays. Now, it took until the 1980s for the term conformal radiation therapy, or CFRT, to be formally coined. And most of the techniques for delivering CFRT were based on highly geometrical shaping of beams. These were the very first attempts to improve on these very poor distributions that were obtained by just crossfire. And there were really two key pioneering centers at the early days. One was the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and the other was the Deutsche Krebsforschungszentrum in Heidelberg. Intensity modulated radiotherapy that enables us to wrap the high-dose volume closely around the target began a few years later, although the term was not formally used until 1996, and I'll explain how that came to be. Before that, we talked about beam modulation. And interestingly, while rotation therapy was invented in the 1950s as a form of improvement of conventional therapy, Now, of course, rotation therapy with modulation is one of the most important techniques that we have to deliver IMRT. So people talk about VMAT and all sorts of other acronyms. They are really just very clever ways of delivering IMRT through rotation with changing field shapes. Now, the problem of becoming old and retired is that you end up with thousands of slides of data, of equipment and planning and delivery, conference travel and all the scientists who populated these events. And today what I hope to do is perhaps to entertain you a little bit more with a story which will have some illustrations, and it will talk about the history of IMRT and link it to my strong associations with Germany. So if we go right back to the beginning, the very first paper on IMRT as such is usually recognized to be from Anders Brammer in about 1981. He might be referred to as the father of IMRT. He was based in the Karolinska in Stockholm, but this paper was an extremely simple mathematical case, which I won't go through in detail. But by the late 1980s, he had developed the thinking of the inverse problem to the point that he could make several visits. And I want to draw your attention to these very important initials along the bottom. He made lecture tour visits to the Deutsche Krebsforschungszentrum, to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Hospital, to the Institute of Cancer Research and the Royal Marsden, and to the MD Anderson. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that people in these organizations didn't know how to start work before he came, but I think there is a definite state in which he helped to enthuse those people into the general direction of doing IMRT. Well, my first academic visits to Germany, let me tell you briefly about them. I first came to Germany in 1977 to the 6th ICCR. Think about that. And the conference was held in Göttingen, and it was organized by a man called Ulf Rosenau, and at that time he was the glider champion of Germany. And the conference trip was to go to a little place called Wittgenhausen and to fly along green fields in little four-seater planes piloted by ex-Luftwaffe pilots. And it was the first time I'd ever been in an aeroplane. I was 29 and I was thrilled. And I thought in those days that the little planes were the safe ones, until I got to the end of the runway and the red light came on and the pilot said in his best English that we have a small problem. We have to go back to the beginning and start again. Well, it was a great conference, and I've been to, I think, all the ICCRs pretty well ever since. I next came to Germany, to Hamburg in 1982, where some of you might remember the World Congress, and then the Nuclear Medicine Physics Congress in Goslar. And that began my long association with German universities. This is the busiest slide I will probably put up, and it'll be there for a while. Cancer treatment relies on imaging and radiation delivery throughout the 120-year period. First, one lags behind the other, and then the reverse. Now, in 1988, 3D imaging was extremely well developed with X-ray CT, MRI, ultrasound, SPECT, and PET. But treatment techniques lagged seriously behind. And in 1988, there were just a handful of workers who started this new field of IMRT. I will name some of them. There was Wolfgang Schlegel and Thomas Bortfeldt in Heidelberg, Radi Mohan in New York, Anders Brammer, I've already mentioned, in the Karolinska, Yair Sensor, based in Israel but working in America, Art Boyer in Houston, Alan Lichter in Ann Arbor, Patrick Schellman in Stockholm, Rolf Mackey in Madison, and me in London. And that was the sum total of working staff on IMRT in 1988. Incredibly, only 12 years later, at the turn of the millennium, the main planning and delivery techniques had all been worked out. Clinical treatments were taking place at selective centers, And all this happened in just 1 decade, effectively from a cold start. Now, of course, we know and we take for granted IMRT as a routine treatment worldwide. And I'd like to review in a little bit more detail some of the scientific developments that are stated here. But I'll do this mainly with some pictures. So let me tell you a highly personal story. In 1992, all the developments up to that date had focused on methods to plan IMRT, to do what we called inverse planning, to move from the dose distribution to the modulated fields. And I was asked to review this planning methodology at a meeting of the 3D radiotherapy community in the World Health Organization building in Geneva. And the date was October the 20th, 1992, a date which is absolutely burnt into my memory for the reasons that are just about to be explained. And I was a young brat, and I stood on the platform, and I confidently concluded my talk saying that we had good ways to deliver IMRT in principle, but nobody could do this in practice. Big mistake. Next up on the platform was this very characteristically energetic man, Mark Carroll. Mark Carroll was from a company called the Nomos Corporation, and he followed me showing slides of his multi-vein intensity modulating collimator, the initials giving you the MIMIC. Well, we were shocked. The conference was staggered. This was clearly a moment of history for radiation therapy, and surprisingly, the organizers cancelled the coffee break, and they gave this man the coffee break time to give his talk again. It was seen to be one of those seminal moments in radiation therapy. It caused a storm. But I'm afraid some of us were a little bit less generous, and 2 of us are in this room. That evening, Wolfgang Schlegel and Alan Lichter and a number of us went to the center of Geneva for a dinner in a restaurant at the Rhone Confluence. And we rather rudely suggested that this might be some sort of hoax, because the man was showing slides of equipment that nobody in the world had ever seen. This was a very new way of presenting research. Your conference here and many others show incremental research, piece by piece, in which everyone is going to believe that you're doing it because you are showing things in the exhibition and so on. But nobody had seen any of this before, so we were shocked. And the other thing is that most medical physicists like to hear that the developments come from people they know. And nobody had heard of this man or his company. So it was a great shock. We were, of course, completely wrong. It wasn't a hoax at all. We soon learned otherwise, and the first MIMIC treatments took place in Baylor in spring 1994. Indeed, all clinical IMRT from 1994 until 1997 was delivered with this particular piece of equipment. It was a retrofit. It could be put onto the head of any linear accelerator, and it delivered 2 slices of modulated radiation at a time by a rotation technique in which these vanes were driven in and out under pneumatic pressure. The dwell time of the radiation was thus varied, and so as a result of that, it was possible to do IMRT. 3D volumes were done by moving the patient longitudinally inside the apparatus. This planning was called Peacock Plan, later Corvus, and it was based on the paper that Jürgen referred to last night about simulated annealing, which was published in 1989 in PMB. Now, I think, I may be wrong, because whenever I make bold statements, someone comes up afterwards and says I've forgotten something. I think that England and Germany had the only 2 MIMIC systems that were not in the United States. There was one that went to DKFZ, and the one to London. I never worked for this company, despite several very tempting financial offers, but I collaborated with them for the next 5 years, and we did a great deal of research together, as of course did DKFZ Heidelberg at that time. Now, Alan Lichter, who was seen as a giant of thinking in radiation therapy, postulated what we called Lichter's hypothesis, or Lichter's dilemma. And it was that the community had only a very limited time to prove that IMRT was useful before the patience of the funders and the public would run out. And think about it, there was absolutely no evidence for IMRT going to work. There was no clinical evidence whatsoever. And if you, as I'm sure many of you young people do now, write grant applications in which you've no basis for proposing what you want funded, you don't stand much chance of getting funded. But this was 25 years ago, and things were just a little bit different in those days. Now, after that meeting on 3D radiotherapy, I flew to Heidelberg with some colleagues for the first of what became between 20 and 30 visits over the next 20 plus years as a visiting professor. And we stayed at this interesting building, which those of you who come from Heidelberg will know. We called it the Futterkrippe Hotel, but I gather now it's an Irish pub. And I lived in this little room at the top next to this beast who was about the same size as me, just outside the window. Now, I'd like you to look at the names of the scientists. This is filmed in the Futterkrippe, who at that time were quite young, but who now all have important university hospital positions. And it was a mixture of English and German. You can see here Phil Evans, the seat that I was sitting in, Bill Swindell, Kai-Uwe Gardi, as he then was, Peter Elliott, Wolfgang Schlegel, Roy Bentley, Carsten Schutz, Konrad Preiser, gave his name to Conrad, the treatment planning system, Alan Nahum, Mark Oldham, and Marcus Menker. And that very first night, after this dinner, Wolfgang took us out on the Alte Brücke to see the castle by floodlight, and it was the first of many very important visits to Heidelberg. And the next day, we started work at the DKFZ, and it became a long and fruitful collaboration between DKFZ and London. Now, my apology again, the politics. This was funded by a Framework 2 European grant, which rather emphasized the importance of being in Europe. And as you know, I am deeply ashamed that the people of the UK have voted to leave, because I believe this could do immense damage to collaborative scientific research. Science should know no boundaries, and the free movement of scientists and funding is essential for cancer research. I voted to remain, of course. You can take that as read. Now, in London and Heidelberg, research progressed in parallel with further collaborative and competitive research in Tübingen on IMRT with Friedhof Nüchlin and his colleagues. And if anything, I think I would confess then, and I will confess now, that I always felt Germany had a slight lead on London, maybe a few months. We didn't seem to be able to think of anything that they had not thought of before in Germany. I respected that. So what happened? Thomas Borgfeldt went from the DKFZ in 1992 to Houston to work with Art Boyer, and he developed the multiple static MLC field IMRT delivery method. And the paper on this won the prize for the best paper at the ICCR in Manchester in 1994. Jörg Stein, over here on the left, went to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Hospital in New York, and he developed the dynamic MLC technique. Together with that of Spiro and Chewy and Svensson et al., all the papers came out in the same month in 1994 with effectively the same mathematics and method. And it was said that Jörg had developed his thoughts cycling around Heidelberg. And by then, I think I'd understood that Heidelberg was a very magic city, that if you cycled round enough, you got great thoughts. Earlier, however, I have to point out, David Convery, a student at the Marsden, had delivered modulated beams by sliding Linac jaws 3 years earlier. So we had done that, but we had not made MLC leaves move. That was new. But if you look at Convery's paper, it mentions the possibility. And that paper is one of the 25 that was selected by PMB and is in your bag of papers that they have given you here at this conference. So, by the mid-1990s, the main planning and delivery methods had all been worked out. But not a single patient had been treated except by the NOMOS mimic. Whoops. In 1995, the DKFZ ran a local 3D radiotherapy physics school and invited me to lecture. Baden-Baden hosted another conference in 1995 as well. And in fact, major conferences started to focus exclusively on IMRT, in particular the ICCRs, Manchester in 1994, Salt Lake City in 1997, and Heidelberg in 2000. I looked back through these proceedings, and nearly half the papers were about IMRT. I looked at London IMRT papers, and there were 0. And I'll explain why in a minute. The main techniques have been worked out. And here is Wolfgang, actually next to Roy Bentley, who was the very first person in Europe to do computerized treatment planning. He's still alive and living not too far away from me. So the main work had been done, and by 2000, we knew how to treat non-moving patients really rather well. In May 1996, just going back a bit, the NOMOS Corporation hosted a very glitzy conference in the cowboy town of Durango, Colorado, in the Strata Hotel, which backed on to the Durango and Silverton Railway. This conference was the very first conference in which the words IMRT had ever been used. This book is the first book, the proceedings of this conference, in which IMRT became known as a set of letters. It was filmed. I still have the videotapes, which are very embarrassing to look at now, 20 years later. And the dress was very informal. You weren't allowed into the room if you wore a suit or a tie, and you had to wear these IMRT hats. Incredibly, I still have my IMRT hat. And the next year, I was lecturing on IMRT in Rothenburg ob der Tauber, not far from here, and in 1998 in Berlin. So IMRT had become established. Let's show you a bit more conference hardware, these mugs. In 1999, the Heidelberg IMRT schools were established with 6 directors listed here: Wolfgang, Thomas Bortfeldt, Jürgen Diebus, Wilfried de Neve, Ben Meinheer, and myself. And the first took place in December 1999, and there followed 9 more schools until these closed in May 2010. Lots of these mugs were produced and given to the conference. Interesting, you see, showing you the dynamic MLC technique. So every time you had a cup of coffee, you were reminded of how this was done, first of all, here in Germany. Interesting that the 3rd Heidelberg school was held in London. That's silly, isn't it? But we decided to do that. Now, almost concurrently, the European School for Medical Physics was formed in the winter of 1998 by Yves Lemoine. Friedhof Nuschlin, who's here in the audience, and myself directed the Radiation Therapy Physics Week from very early on. And on the faculty were Thomas Bortfeldt and Wolfgang Schlegel, and later Uwe Ulfke. And I ran the radiotherapy physics teaching of IMRT for about 15 years before this closed after its 16th year, which I believe was a great tragedy for IFOMP and the European Scientific Institute. But a byproduct of these teaching schools was the opportunity to collaborate between London Heidelberg, Tübingen, and other German centers. And it's fitting to note that, as I said, the 2000 ICCR was held in Heidelberg, and that date marks the dates when the key developments had been worked out. A lot of science came out of sitting in cafes and restaurants at either the Heidelberg or the Aachen School. And Heidelberg is famous, of course, for its Philosophenweg, as well as its snow, and dinners down here in the Hackteufel Hotel, where I was kindly put, led to much writing on sheets of paper of interesting physics that later turned into papers. Clinical work started with an MLC at Memorial Sloan Kettering in 1995, in Heidelberg in 1997, in May 1998 in Manchester, and in London in 2000. And I want to show you 4 graphs just to show you how important IMRT is. I'm grateful to colleagues in Heidelberg for the first 2 of these. And you see that from the dates when they started, with hardly any patients, the movement is upwards. If I continue this graph, you will see that it continues to be upwards until around about this time, and I'm told that this flattening off is mainly due to the use of proton therapy, which has become a competing technique. Now, if we look at London, we see the same sort of picture. We see hardly any patients until we started in 2000. And then here is this upward movement. You needn't worry about the details. It just tells you all the planning systems that we used and which sites. The main thing to show is how this graph goes up and continues to go up. And if we don't have any protons in London yet, so if you look at the graph, it continues to rise as we come to the present day. Now, strangely, the use of the nomos mimic curiously declined, and we don't really know why that is. And for an unknown reason, the USA lost its market lead of some 2 years. The multi-leaf collimator became the instrument of choice, and all 3 companies were in competition. Elekta formed the International IMRT Consortium in 1994 with just 4 centers and 8 members. And we met in a rather miserable Gatwick Airport Hotel for the very first meeting. This grew eventually to the 9 centers that you see here and 70 attendees at the twice-yearly meetings by 2000. And then it was dissolved. I was the chairman at the time when it was dissolved, and it was done this was done because Elekta didn't want the centers who were not parts of the consortium to feel that they were excluded from IMRT. So that tells you something very important. If you're the scientist in charge of the funding, as I was, the pulling out of a major company is not good news. But looking back on it, it was the right decision because it meant that that piece of work had been finished. And one thing scientists are extremely loath to do is to finish something and start something new. Well, similar things happened with Varian in the United States and with Siemens in Germany. And from 2000 onwards, IMRT became a routine clinical method. ICCR in London, which was held in June of this year, I looked at the proceedings and there were no papers on IMRT, none whatsoever. And the reason for that is that there was no real need to have papers on the physics of planning and delivering IMRT. Well, in 2001, I published a paper with Tony Lomax called "There is no IMRT, so I'm a fraud." Indeed, there isn't. Intensity or X-ray fluence is almost never modulated. What occurs is that unmodulated fields of different geometrical shape, size, time duration, and direction are superposed, so the effect is of modulating intensity. But the name IMRT has stuck. So understanding this allows one to see how IMRT can be delivered by a large number of alternative means, some of them relatively simple and some of them very complex. One of the complex techniques is the Accuray robot. I was in Japan in 2001 when this was first starting to be used there. DKFZ built a variable aperture collimator for the robot, very much emphasizing the importance of having local engineering facilities. And of course, those workshops had designed MLCs for many years in the past, including this one, the famous micro MLC, that was put onto a LINAC, a little bit like you would put a gamma ray collimator on a gamma camera. And the same workshop also produced this, clever ways to change the shape of the end of the leaf as it moved across the field by having one cog driving a train of two separate cogs, racks of teeth, each with a slightly different number of teeth per centimeter. As the leaf moves across, the ends will tilt. Very clever technique. London and Heidelberg collaborated together to build this prototype variable aperture scanning collimator, the VAC. This is the student who worked on it, James Anderson. I think he's outside at the bottom of the Philosophenweg, the physics building at the bottom of the Philosophenweg here. We did get up to the top. We must have got down again. As you see, it was very snowy for that visit. And I also worked out ways to deliver IMRT with rotating and translating slit jewels, as well as simple shuttling collimator elements. None of these things made the market. And I was firmly advised by the MLC industry not to challenge the accepted use of the MLC. Towards the end of my career, I got a little bit anxious about this. And I published this paper, almost the last paper I published, called "The Fish IMRT Needs a Bicycle, MLC. The bicycle factories seem to be flourishing." MLC factories. Not so the goldfish bowl factories. Now, you will know that this is based on the original quote, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle," which is from the Australian social activist Patricia Irina Dunn. And if you want to enjoy yourselves, Google fish and bicycle, and you will see thousands of pictures and discussions of this matter of political correctness, shall we say. I believe there's still a role. This paper was published and totally ignored. That's fine. But I believe that there's a role for simpler IMRT methods for those centres who can't deliver expensive mainstream equipment. Now, research in IMRT planning and delivery never seems to stop, but I would suggest that perhaps it should. We know now how to treat the unmoving patient, a phantom, a piece of plastic. And in my opinion, you can disagree if you like, further research in this area adds almost nothing. The focus of research shifted in 2004 into the problem of treating the moving patient, something very much not solved. An enormous number of papers were published, including the breathing MLC leaves method, but very little, again, has reached the clinic apart from simple gating and robotics. Indeed, the MR Linac is now regarded perhaps as the potential technique market leader, and it's interesting that you're focusing on that in this conference. Several prototype machines are under development, one is coming to London, and so suspicions are beginning to be raised that we now can't adequately 3D image the target. Well, that takes us back 28 years to when everyone thought that was solved. We knew how to image the target, we just couldn't reach it. Now we can reach it, but we're not sure where it is anymore. So you see how imaging and therapy cycle round. Well, a mark of the impact of a technique is the number of times one's asked to give some named lecture on the subject. And I've been asked to talk about IMRT several times, and I put this slide up not to promote my own importance, but to show why the institute I come from are recognized for this activity. I gave the Sylvanus Thompson lecture in 2004. Now, many of you won't know who Sylvanus Thompson was, but he published a very famous book in calculus. He was professor at the Finsbury Institute in North London in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in the preface to this book, he wrote this interesting piece of text. He said, "Considering how many fools can calculate, it's surprising that it should be thought either a difficult or tedious task for some other fool to learn how to master the same tricks. The fools who write the textbooks of advanced mathematics, and they are mostly clever fools, seldom take the trouble to show you how easy the calculations actually can be. On the contrary, they seem to desire to impress you with their tremendous cleverness by going about it in the most difficult way." Well, my lecture was entirely based on how to apply that approach to simplify the understanding of IMRT, something I've tried to do over a period of time with varying success in this quartet of books, which some of you will know. So returning to Germany and the German-UK connection, I was privileged to give the 60th birthday lecture for Wolfgang in 2005 in Heidelberg, and in 2008 he very kindly returned the compliment by doing this at my Festschrift in London. So how is true progress made in medical physics? Newton wrote, "If I've seen a little bit further than most men, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants." And in fact, that phrase was wrapped around the outside of the British £1 coin for many years, and the title's been used for many books. History shows that a large number of individual pioneers nearly achieved some goal before one person finally made the product and is remembered forever. So certainly the principles of CT were patented in Germany in 1940 by Gabriel Frank. So that's 32 years before the CT scanner, okay? It was known how to do this in Germany. And a CT scanner was reputedly built in the USSR in the 1950s as well. IMRT can be traced back to Takahashi in the 1950s and Basil Proimos in New York in 1961. So concave isodoses, don't be fooled, they're not new. They've been around for 55 years. It's just that to do this for every patient was a little bit tedious. And there's a patent for the MLC from Gescheiden, also in 1959. So the MLC also is not new. The principles of IMRT were known in 1940. What's this all about? It was shown mathematically that you can do any drawing by taking lines from different directions of different blacknesses to solve all the problems you couldn't solve when you started your PhD. It's a little bit cynical. And this lady has been developing DNA computing to perhaps increase computing by 10 orders of magnitude. I'm nearly finished, Mr. Chairman. It's hard and it's foolish to predict the future, but when you get old, people like you to do this. And in fact, there's some pretty appalling mispredictions. Let's look at a few of them. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. Chairman of IBM, 1943. There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And that was in 1997. How about the biggest mistake of all time? Bill Gates, 1981. 640K ought to be quite enough for anybody. So looking back, here's my cartoon out of The Guardian. The prophet is on the hill and the disciples are listening, and he says, "I predict that all my predictions will be wrong." And they say, "Good heavens, he said that last year, and he was right." So asking people to crystal ball gaze is not science. It is fun. You get some interesting lectures, but you don't necessarily get it right. So I have 3 more slides, Mr. Chairman, and then I'll be finished, I hope, just on time. This is a busy slide, but it says the important things that I want to get over to you. What conditions are needed to happen for progress to take place? Well, first of all, medical physicists need to be educated at school to find science, which, let's face it, is difficult to do, interesting, and to keep going. They need to know that while specializing in medical physics is possible, many medical physics breakthroughs have come from applying the physics from mainstream areas. And so we need to accept into our profession people who've not been trained in medical physics. I think people need to be allowed enough what I call big me time to do research properly. So although duties in the clinic are very important, you can't fit in the research in the last few odd minutes of each day. I think we need to be encouraged, allowed to fail and to follow some blind alleys. And too much grant-driven research will just kill the process. I think it's famously been said that Mr. Einstein would never have won a grant. And we mustn't repeat things, and that's the job of we older people, to make sure that doesn't happen, because otherwise, and you often see this at conferences, the same things are being studied as were studied 30 years ago by people who just don't realize that those things were so studied. Of course, we need to be supported by national and international organizations with education programs, and it's important to have training schemes, but not so imposing that they get in the way of people thinking. And, oh dear, this is perhaps a bit controversial. Physicists need to be doing physics. Too many people today, if you look around you in your organization, will be doing scientific business and politics, in fact anything rather than doing any physics. And I think that gets in the way. And we need to be supported by government, society, and family. So I come to my last slide, Mr. Chairman. To return to the beginning, this is the Royal Marsden Hospital in Chelsea, in London, in 1860. Well, there are certainly no London buses or tube trains. And here is the world's first medical physicist. He was called Major Charles Phillips, and he was a gentleman scientist. He was head of the physics department, which wasn't difficult because he was the only physicist. So he was head of a department of one. But the thing that makes him stand out is that he never drew a salary. He came to work because it was fun. And I gave this slide in one of my many lectures with my chief executive sitting in the front row, and he was busy writing at this point. I think he thought if we would come to work without pay, that would solve some of his problems. Well, I can't remember that far back. Here's the Sheffield doctor, William Marsden. But what I can tell you, and this is bringing the story to its conclusion, is that when the news of Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen's discovery 500 yards up the road reached London, the experiment was repeated by Major Charles Phillips. And being a good lad, he wrote everything down, and his laboratory notebooks were kept, and I had them at one stage. They've gone now into a memorial, but I was able to read them, and he wrote how excited he was to be able to demonstrate X-rays in London the first week after they'd been demonstrated here in Würzburg. So I like to think that this man is the pioneering Anglo-German research worker in medical physics. So I finished at that point, 1 minute late, I'm sorry, but thank you very much for electing me as the very first non-German member, and for me that is a very, very important thing, and I hope my lecture has been able to explain why. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this wonderful, historical, personally stained journey into the development, into the sources, into the many people who contributed to bring this field to its full life as we see it today. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. That's for me? Oh, thank you very much. Oh, from Heidelberg. Oh, thank you. From Wolfsburg itself.